Welcome to Brain Wellness, the podcast. I'm your host, Mandy NP. Each episode will bring you a new topic or interview related to brain health and wellness as part of my mission to help you on the path to a healthier, happier brain. So, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Brain Wellness, the podcast. My guest today is Parker Nelson. Parker is a registered dietitian with a bachelor's in business marketing and a master's in applied nutrition. He currently works as a dietitian at an eating disorder treatment center and works one-on-one with individuals seeking weight management advice and general nutrition counseling. He lives in Northern California with his wife, Alexis, and his two boys, Collin and Max. Thank you for being here today, Parker.
Yeah, excited to be here.
Yeah. So I love talking nutrition because there's a huge connection between nutrition and the brain. So I'm always looking forward to these conversations. But before we kind of get into that, I always like to hear everybody's backstory. How did you get to where you are now?
That's a great question.
Mhm.
I first was interested in health and nutrition all the way back from playing sports growing up because health and nutrition is very tied to moving around and the physicality of sports. So I think that was always part of the interest. And then as I got older, had a lot of like family health issues that got me more interested. And then the turning point was probably after college. I dropped about 60 pounds. And so that got me really headfirst into, why did this happen? How did this come about? And it wasn't intentional, but I could tell that there were choices being made that were different. So I wanted to explore that for myself. So I wanted to know personally how my nutrition affected me and especially that weight loss journey. And then I wanted to essentially help others with the same, nutrition goals, health goals, and just figuring out, what that means for them. So that took me to the path of after I got a business degree, I thought, nah, this isn't for me. So I switched and went to nutrition for my master's, and I've been in it since.
Very cool. Very cool. How did you get involved in disordered eating then?
Yeah, so that is really just the function of looking for a job after my master's. So once I finished my program, I was kind of searching for something that wasn't as clinical or at least like hospital based because, I first got a nutrition certification before the program that I did. And it was a lot more of that, like what people call like a holistic approach, where it doesn't end up in like hospital programs or like clinical spaces as much. And it's a lot more of the function of like day to day, what people are going through. And so having that in my background, I definitely valued more of like a private practice outlook. So I definitely started that after school, but I knew I don't think this is going to carry me. Like I have a family, I got to get some benefits. And so was looking for spaces that weren't as, like, oh, I have to be in the ICU and kind of be like helping with tube feeding all the time, which is a lot of, some of the clinical aspects of nutrition.
Mhm.
And so those are very valuable. But for me, it just wasn't like I couldn't see myself there every day.
Mhm.
So I went to, I found a job in eating disorders and I wasn't totally sure about it, but it was different enough. And ever since I started, it was perfect for me. There's a lot of mental health involved in it, a lot of brain health going on there. And my wife's a therapist as well. So I think that I naturally sort of just floated towards that job space. And it's been great.
Yeah. I love when we accidentally find our passions in life. I think that just kind of gets you even more because you weren't expecting it.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very cool. I kind of fell into neurology initially,
Mm.
long time ago, but I went to school thinking I was going to either be a cardiology nurse or a labor delivery because I loved the baby aspect of it. And in my rotations, I'm like, nope, nope. And then
Yeah.
accidentally got a job in neurology, and oh my gosh, that absolutely was where I was meant to be. So I love when that happens. Um,
That's
where,
awesome.
what kind of eating disorders do you tend to deal with? I think most people know about like anorexia, bulimia, but those are not the only eating disorders out there.
That's right. So, really, what's interesting is those are the most common eating disorders within an environment that we're working with. So, I'm in a residential care facility. So if you have, you're really unstable from an eating disorder, you'll probably end up in the hospital. The next step down is like a residential care facility where you're living there 24 hours. So that's where I work. And so that's probably what most people are used to hearing about because that's where you end up with if you're very malnourished. So, for example, like anorexia. Bulimia is also a very significant health problem because if you're binging and purging with food, then you can have some extreme, electrolyte imbalances and you can be really malnourished as well to the point where you need to be somewhere 24 hours for care. So that's why it's probably more talked about and is more like interesting from a cultural perspective. But when we talk about eating disorders just in general population, binge eating is far and away the most common one. And it's just because I think there's a lot of normalization around it where people, everyone from like bodybuilders to regular athletes and just normal people will binge eat from time to time and won't think of it, won't think twice of it. But if it's an ongoing problem and it's affecting someone's health, then it probably is an eating disorder or at least disordered eating, which is kind of that step down. So binge eating is very common. Anorexia and bulimia is what we see the most of. And then there are quite a few of like these smaller, less diagnosed ones. One that came out just about a decade ago is called ARFID, which is avoidant restricted food intake disorder. And that essentially, for most people who don't know that one, it's what you might have thought your friend growing up with had if they said, "Oh, I was a really picky eater and I avoided multiple food groups where there were certain textures that were so difficult to eat, it made them like gag after or trying to eat food." And so there are, people with ARFID, and we see quite a few patients with that now. And it affects their intake level so much so that it's very similar to the presentation of anorexia, where they'll have very, very low weight, they'll be very malnourished, and so just trying to find enough food and the right kinds of food for them to get healthy again.
Mm-hmm. Do you see any kind of disordered eating patterns that lead to obesity other than people just overeating?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like most eating disorders in general are a function of, like genetics combined with a problem in their environment. And that usually leads to this very extreme behavior cycle where you might have restricted in the past, but then it led to binging in the future. And that would lead to being overweight. Same thing with like you might binge on food and then purge and throw up your food because you felt guilt or shame around it. But in the future, if you learned ways to not do that as much, you could still be binging without that. And that could lead to being overweight as well. So there's quite a few different ways to get to that path. And it doesn't have to just be like, I'm a binge eater, but you might end up overeating even in small amounts over time that come from this kind of extreme behavior or this extreme thinking.
Sure, sure. Why is it so hard for people to get out of disordered eating patterns?
So, a lot of the people that we see, they come from a place where their life was not well set up for them to succeed. And if you're in that situation, it's just 50 times harder to get out of it. If you don't have the resources, like you're financially struggling and you had abusive parents and you had a lot of childhood trauma and you didn't get coping skills to deal with these things because you didn't have a good education path and a good upbringing, and you have all of these things combined, I just can't imagine how hard it would be to shift behaviors. Even now, like trying to start a new habit for myself is really challenging. And this is the line of work that I do. So even, I can see how someone who didn't get the right education, the right coping skills, the right, support and resources around them would struggle a lot to be able to shift their mindset, create new habits, and then avoid some of these eating disorder behaviors in general.
Yeah. Are there steps that we can do to try to combat this on our own?
Yeah, certainly. So I think probably the biggest step, if you think you have something that is really drastic, like it's affecting your health to the point where you're malnourished, or you know that your weight is way too low or way too high, or you're just, yeah, you're not functioning well, you may have to use some resource like Google, or if you know like a primary care physician that you work with, you might want to reach out. and find a local resource of like an eating disorder therapist or an eating disorder dietitian. And they can work with you and kind of plan those first steps. For a lot of people, they may not have the healthcare or the ability to kind of get those resources underhand. So if you hear, us talking about it right now, it might just be taking the first steps of talking to other people, because you'd be surprised how many people have either gone through this themselves or have thought about it or have a friend that have gone through it. And so talking to other people about it, even in your family, could be helpful to kind of get those steps started of saying, oh, well, here's the first step that I took when I had this. Or, I know someone who had this, and the first step was just meal planning or getting, the first steps of eating the right kind of food and just starting with, the basics. So I think getting the resources in healthcare is probably the best one. But if you can't do that, I think you can talk to people around you.
Okay. If people do end up to the point where they are severe enough that they would need a hospitalization stay, what are some of the things that you guys work on while they're hospitalized?
Yeah. So while they're at our facility, probably the biggest one, especially that I do, is weight restoration.
Mm.
So if someone comes in and they lost, 20, 30 pounds over the last couple of months, or they've just been chronically underweight for a really long time, their body doesn't have the nourishment to function physically and mentally. So, being on this podcast with you, we're talking about that brain health aspect. So it's actually pretty unbelievable the shift that we'll see in patients when we start to get them eating food again and their weight comes up, their brain actually starts working at a higher level.
Mhm.
And it's not surprising because our brain is within our body. So it needs, nutrients like sugar and glucose, it needs micronutrients, it needs omega-3 fats. So it needs these things from our food. So if you're starving it of that over time, you essentially go back to what we call caveman brain, which is what we use. We use that a lot of times in like eating disorder language because you're really at this level of like, I can't comprehend new information. I can't make new habits. I can't create new pathways for myself if I'm so stuck in this almost like fight or flight mode of no, I'm restricting food. No, I'm restricting food. And until you actually just like start to take in that nourishment, then your brain can start to see nuance again and it stops thinking in such black and white terms. And then you start to say, oh, okay, I can make this new habit one day at a time. I can start to engage with the therapy more, which is a lot of the treatment as well. So beyond just the weight restoration, we have therapy every week. You go to individual sessions, you have group sessions. And then we also have, a psychiatrist, we have nurses on staff. So we have a lot of different healthcare workers where they're working on the different aspects of brain and body health to kind of re-nourish patients to that helpful state.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on that. One, when I worked in the clinic before, prior to my own injury and everything, I was always talking with patients about they would come in with concerns for memory loss, for concentration issues, and some of the bigger things that we talked about were vitamin deficiencies, because some of those vitamins that if you're not getting it through your food are going to make a big impact. And I can see that's probably some of the things that you're talking about when you see their brain starting to work again. They're getting those vitamins, they're getting the nutrients that they need.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's a lot of times too, where normally I'm not big on trying to get everyone supplements or give everyone like a fish oil or something. But, we give a lot of things right off the bat because people have just been missing it for so long that their body can't get it from food that quickly. So there is a lot of like, you take a multivitamin, you take a fish oil, you might take some things where general population might not need to take it all the time. But
Mhm.
that's where supplements can be really helpful in these kinds of populations for sure.
Yeah. So you said you can't get it that quickly. How long does it take to get some of these nutrients into the body after they've been depleted?
Yeah. So, part of the issue is if you're used to eating such a small restrictive diet, so a lot of patients will come in and be like, I've only had a few hundred calories per day. Their stomachs and their bodies are just not used to taking in food.
Mhm.
So it's unlikely that they're going to go from 0 to 60 very quickly. So they're not going to start eating full meals, especially meals that are going to put weight back on right from day one. And so it's going to take a little bit of time to eat enough food just to feel okay with it. And honestly, a lot of patients can't even keep it down right away because of that restriction for so long. So it does start from a small place, and then we progress every day, add a little bit more in. So it takes time just from like the fullness and the motility of your gut aspect, but then also from, there's some absorption issues that can happen over time. And as they start to, feed again and have more food in their system, their body starts to replenish different areas. So it might add some, sugar to the brain to get it to start working. It might start replenishing some like muscle storage and some liver storage. But there's going to be a lot of functions that, are still taking a back seat because your body's still trying to replenish other areas of your body. So you may have, a low immunity for a little while because your body doesn't favor that compared to getting your heart back on track, for example. So it definitely takes, you know, quite a few weeks and sometimes months to get all the nutrients back into places and just to put weight back on to support their body functionally.
Yeah. And the other thought that I had before that I wanted to kind of bring up as it came up in here was that idea of putting weight back on. So a lot of times these eating disorders come from body image disturbances. So as they're putting weight back on, I'm glad to hear that you've got psychiatrists and everything on board because I can only imagine that there's some issues as they are putting that weight back on.
That's such a good point. So most eating disorder facilities have specific groups that are like body image groups because that is a huge component, not only of recovery and understanding your body's going to change from this experience, but usually that's why someone came in the first place. At least some factor of it. So I'll have a lot of patients who come in and they might rationally know that it doesn't make any sense to be, extremely skinny or to have like no muscle function, or to be starving all the time. But irrationally, it's like they were just so taken by this idea that like someone who in their childhood told them like you're too big, you're too fat, your body is not right. It could even be from like social media these days. You might be told over and over again or see images of people. And so you end up with those like body dysmorphia beliefs in your brain. And so it is a huge component of getting better, which is shifting that mindset of your body is not okay to it's going to change. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but we want to prioritize function over aesthetics. And so that takes a lot of work, a lot of therapy work. And that's definitely a big focus that we have.
Yeah. Yeah. That's I can see that being a really big piece there. What other things do you see patients having to overcome as they get back into normal eating, I guess?
Yeah, I think two things come to mind. One is the beliefs that they want to change. So it's, if someone's been walking a path, especially from like a brain standpoint, for years at a time, where it's like, I'm supposed to restrict, or I'm supposed to purge my food afterwards, or I'm supposed to binge, or this is how I do things with food, it's so easy to stay in that path. So for someone to come in for, 3 weeks, 6 weeks, something like that, and to expect them to completely make new grooves in their brain and to create a new path that's so easy to walk compared to the one they've been doing for like 10 plus years, it's pretty uncommon that someone's going to make that easy of a switch. I've only seen it a couple times where someone comes in and they go, this was my light bulb moment. Most of the time, by the time they're leaving, their beliefs are not completely internalized. Like they do not necessarily go, yes, I'm okay with a bigger body, or I'm okay with having more function over the aesthetic piece that I was looking for. Or I'm okay with eating, you know, at least 1600, 1800, 2000 calories a day because I was so used to restricting for a long time. So the beliefs don't change overnight and they don't even change over weeks or months usually. Um, but sometimes it's just planting that seed that helps them down the road. That can be a big factor for that. And then I think the other thing is talking back about that environment piece. So when someone goes home, usually they came from an environment that was very toxic. So they may have come from, parents that were separated and were abusive. They may have come from, siblings who were unkind to them, or family and friends that were not helpful in this aspect. Maybe they were contributing to the, the body dysmorphia or something. And so going back to those environments, it's like, well, the work we just did is about to be either undone or met with quite a bit of hostility. So I have so many patients where they come in, and a lot of the patients we work with are 17, 18, 19 years old. So they're still living under parents' roof.
Mhm.
And even though they come in and say, I would love to change, I would love to eat a very like healthy, balanced diet, they're going back to parents who have their own eating disorders. And the parents don't know it, and they've been in it even longer, and believe that their kids need to eat a certain way and need to, not ever have breakfast or lunch or something like that. And so going back to environments that aren't helpful is probably one of the biggest challenges and barriers to recovery.
Yeah, I can totally see that. What's the piece of advice you think you give the most often for nutrition for the clients you work with disordered eating?
I think it's to change the mindset from black and white to a nuanced way of thinking. It's one that's really hard for people to actually shift, because I think just as humans, it's a little easier to say there's yes and no answers to everything, and to view nutrition in an aspect of like food is either good or bad. But there's so many foods where they're context dependent, like bread. If you tell someone like, I have a fear of bread, well, there's so many different kinds of bread on the market. Like you can make homemade bread that, is this beautiful sourdough. You can get it with great ingredients, or you can have a bread that makes you more likely to binge. That's like this very sugary white bread from the market. And either one of those like can fit into the context of a healthy diet, but at the same time, like they're not the same thing. And so I think the language piece just needs to shift from good and bad, yes or no, healthy, unhealthy, to, what does this mean for me personally? Like, is this food okay for me right now? Like, did I already have it today? Does it fit in my diet? Does it, promote health for myself? And that might change from day to day or season to season of your life. So I think a lot of people have a hard time believing that because they were brought up in an environment where, answers were black and white. And it's just, oh, this sugary food is bad for you, or this fat food is bad for you. And so they might see something like oil, for example, which is a very calorie dense food. A lot of people have a fear of oil and sugar because to them it's calorie dense, and that means fat. So it basically they equate oil, sugar equals bad. But in the context of like cooking and like a culinary masterpiece, people who make really good food, they know if you use the right dosage of those things, it creates, actually a lot of health promotion in your body. And it's this beautiful experience of enjoying food. And so there's a lot of context pieces that make it, good sometimes, not as good as others. And so it's really that spectrum thinking that I try to get people working towards. I think the best example is a lot of times I'll show people what food processing means. And so I'll have this little scale that I'll write out on like a whiteboard. And on one end, I'll have something like an apple. And then on the other end, I'll have something like apple juice concentrate. And you can see how food processing is not, a food is either processed or unprocessed. But like you can have apple juice, you can have apple sauce, you can have apple that goes in like a homemade pie, you can have sliced apples. So it's not that apples are good or bad, unprocessed or processed. There's actually quite a spectrum and a range in which apples exist. And so that kind of opens their eyes to, oh, not everything is yes or no, healthy, unhealthy. It kind of depends, and it's context dependent, which again is like it takes a lot of work. It takes a mindset shift, but if you can get there and start to learn it, it does open a lot of doors for recovery.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, Two things I got out of that, the context part of it, and when you were talking about going back to homes, when I was driving in the car on the way to work the other day, on the radio, they were talking about a situation that came up literally with just recently with some high school kids. This child had a sleepover party and they invited a bunch of friends over and they had pizza and pop. And the parents didn't like announce it to the kids, like what foods were going to be served. And when some of the parents found out about it, they went on a rampage and how dare you feed my child pizza? But it's kind of goes back to that whole 90-10 rule. Usually when we say when you're healthy, you can't be healthy 100% of the time. Otherwise, it does lead to disordered eating because then you start thinking of things as bad foods and you can't ever have them. And so to kind of go crazy on this parent for doing a simple thing of having pizza and pop for a sleepover It's not something I do every day. It's just a
Right.
sometimes thing. Um, I know I kind of bombarded you with that, but what are your initial thoughts when you hear that?
Oh man, that is such a good example of, the parents who react poorly to that are the ones who don't understand exactly what we're talking about here, which is you're actually more likely to succeed if you have those moments from time to time where you say, I'm going to let myself indulge in something. Because those indulgent breaks, what we see in studies, what we see in practice, what we see in just everyday life with people is when you have these breaks from time to time where you let go and say, I'm going to enjoy pizza and soda tonight, you're more likely for the rest of the week to say, like, I can look forward to these things, so I'm going to do really well on all my other meals. So people are much more likely to do well in the off time on that. But the people who see it as 100% or a race or a comparison game, as it needs to be perfect, are usually the ones who go to such extremes that they restrict too much, or they don't eat the right kind of foods, or they don't have enough food, or we're even taking away from things that aren't nutrition based, which is like you now suffer social health or mental health, which again are the things that might lead to future binging, restricting, purging. So it's really like if you're not able to accept from time to time a party where you have treats like that, it probably says a lot about the mindset you have towards a lot of habits and behaviors. And it's probably ones where you're probably going to be too extreme and you're going to lead to problematic things down the road. So I think you're right that, again, like if you're a person who's serving pizza and soda to your kids every single day, every single meal, every single night, that is the problem. And I think that's what people wanted to push back against. But
Mhm.
swinging the pendulum the other way to never having it, it's actually less likely that you'll succeed in the long run.
Yeah, yeah, that was kind of my first thought too. I just sat stunned, like, what is happening here? It was so
Yeah.
bizarre. So, given that, what's one piece of advice that you would love to give kind of the general population about nutrition?
I think the best thing that I usually tell people is to start with one habit. And so I think a lot of times people think, kind of back to that black and white thinking, I have disordered eating or my nutrition is either bad or good. And so they try to upend everything at once. They try to overhaul and throw out everything from their pantry, or they try to say, like, I'm not going to go to any fast food this week. I think the goal should be pick the thing that could be the most helpful right now and start with that. And it might be one factor within your nutrition. So for a lot of people, I think they might say to themselves, well, I want to save some money. I want to learn to cook and I do want to eat a little bit better. Great. So let's say you eat out 5 nights a week. Maybe you just tell yourself, I'm going to set a goal for this next month. It's only going to be 2 nights a week. And that means going to the grocery store, meal prepping a little bit, and having that food on hand. Maybe it means looking up 2 recipes, before you go shopping so that you have those under your belt. There's such good resources online now, like eatingwell.com. Even ChatGPT is such a great resource for just finding quick recipes and menus. So I think we have those resources, and it's just about starting with one at a time. Because as soon as you do that one, it essentially leads to that snowball effect of, wow, I feel good doing this. Now I think I'm going to, increase the amount of protein in my diet or increase my fiber, or I'm going to shoot to limit like the sugary snacks that I bring to work. And so I think you can make those behaviors as you go. But if you do all of them at once, usually what happens is kind of like the pizza party,
Yeah,
which is you essentially say no. And then a month from now, you go, that was too hard. I think I'm just going to go back to my old ways. So
yeah.
starting with one habit at a time.
Yeah, I love that. I think I've done similar things with patients as well. And as we talk about things, because it is too hard to make all the changes at the same time. But if you make simple substitutions, one for another, little bits as you go, it makes it so much more palatable, literally
Yes,
and
definitely.
figuratively.
That's right.
Yeah. Um, do you have any upcoming projects or things you'd like to share with the listeners? I think I saw one that you
So,
had listed on there for me. Yeah.
oh yeah, well, I wrote a book called Nutrition Nonsense, and that's kind of been circulating since January, and so I like pointing people towards that, and it talks about all the nutrition myths that we encounter and why we encounter them and how you can get over them. So I love kind of pointing people towards that. I'm working on a new book and I keep shifting on like what my new book is going to be. But this next book, I think, is going to be on how to eat out well.
Mm.
Because I think most of the patients and clients I work with, they struggle because they say, well, let me start my good nutrition after I get back from vacation. But you're going to keep going on vacation for the rest of your life. You're going to keep going to restaurants and parties. So I think I'm going to create a very short book that talks about how you can balance good nutrition with indulgent eating. And so I think that's probably my next project. But always working on things because I'm passionate about it.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about your book or anything that you're up to?
So on Instagram is where I make videos and content from time to time. My Instagram handle is Nutrition Advocate. So you can find me there, message me. I usually have links on there as well. So I have a link tree where you can find like handouts that I've made. A lot of people find those helpful for like weight loss or, weight gain, how to increase fiber, things like that. So go to that resource and you can find pretty much everything from me.
Nice, nice. I will include that in the show notes as well so people can click on it and they don't have to write anything down while they're driving. I
Yay.
so much appreciate you today. Any last words of wisdom you'd like to share as we wrap up?
Oh, I mean, coming from the brain wellness podcast, I think really just that your mental health is usually just as important as your physical health. And a lot of times the mental health is what leads you to create better physical health. So I think if you can prioritize, either therapy or, mindfulness in a daily experience, I think that'll help a lot.
Perfect. Great way to end the show. Thank you so much, Parker.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Brain Wellness, the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to subscribe, like, and share this with others to help me continue on with my mission to help people live healthier, happier lives. Go to www.brainwellnesssolutions.com to see what I'm up to and get links to all the social medias there. See you next time.